Mary Donald was one of the victims. In 1946, when Mary was only 10 years old, the sheriff brought her to Lynchburg, along with her brother and sister. Her mother was already there. Mary had no idea why she had been taken to the colony. When she arrived, she was frightened and confused.
I said, I don't understand this place. What I'm doing over here? So, well, nurse come downstairs on the elevator, took me on up to the hospital, on the hospital ward. And the first thing they did then, they put me in the bathtub, bathed me and all like that, you know. Well, but I was old enough to bathe myself. But they done that for you, see. And after I stayed there for a while, Dr. Ramsey, he was doctor. He examined me and all. And see if I, you know what I mean. Well, and I knew him real good. And then if I stayed on the hospital for a while, they sent me down on wards, on Ward 5. That was the first ward I was ever on. I was a kid, at 10 years old.
At the Lynchburg colony, Mary was one of 1,700 inmates. Some were epileptic, mentally retarded, or severely disabled. Most, however, like Mary, had been committed using the spurious diagnosis of feeble-mindedness. This was a catch-all phrase the authorities used to classify Virginia's poor and ill-educated whites. They were thought to be socially inadequate and a burden on the state. Lynchburg had become a dumping ground for such people. What Mary and the other inmates did not know was that they were to be sexually sterilized as part of a systematic program of social engineering.
They said, you got to be operated on. I said, for what? And they said, well, it's for your own health. They didn't tell me anything. It was for being sterilized when you get married, you can have no children. They didn't tell me that. And after that, I went on, I stayed on the hospital that 2 weeks in a coma. They sterilized me when I was 11 years old. And they almost lost me. And only thing I remember, the nurse said, well, it's up to God now, she lives.
After her sterilization, Mary was kept at Lynchburg. She attended the colony's schoolhouse, but received little education. The school teacher for 25 years was Charles Wills.
The society would say, we don't think it's a good idea for these people to continue to have many children not being able to take care of themselves. So the law permitted them to come to the colony at that time, and then they would be presented at our psychologist, social worker. We would work with them to see how they functioned in our environment. Then the psychologists and social workers, nurses and medical people would check them out and say, well, this is familial retardation. Yes, he may be eligible for sterilization. Here again, I'm encroaching on the medical field because I'm looking at it from an educational point of view. He would not be able to function much more than at the primary level. He could hold a routine job down, maybe working in the field, picking apples and picking tobacco and things like that. But he would have a difficult time managing his own money. And so they would, if he met the criteria, he would be eligible for sterilization.
I was about, say, about 16 years old, 16, when I learned what it was all about. You know, they did a whole lot of girls that way, a whole bunch of them. I'm not the only one. And one girl, she was operating, and she was, I don't know, well, I'm going to tell you anyway. Anyway, she was pregnant. They didn't examine her and see if she was pregnant or not. And they went on and done the operation. I ain't call no name. It done the operation. When they operate, they kill a little baby.
The extent of Virginia's sterilization program began to emerge in 1980. Reported numbers of victims grew until the final total was found to be 8,300. Grave concerns over the legality and the ethics of the state-run program began to be voiced. At the time, Judy Crockett was working for the American Civil Liberties Union in Richmond, Virginia. She felt that the forced sterilization of children at Lynchburg had violated their constitutional rights. The ACLU prepared to sue the state of Virginia on behalf of the victims.
It was huge publicity. It was everywhere. And Virginia is very proud of its history, and this was a piece of history that they couldn't be proud of and nobody else was proud of. So the state wanted this to die down as quickly as it possibly could. And we, of course, were not interested in having it die down. We wanted it to keep going until it got fixed. We wanted the law fixed. We wanted to make sure it was never going to happen again. And the best way to do that would be to make sure that it was embarrassing enough and enough people knew about it and really understood what had happened.
Judy learned that the story began back in 1910, when Lynchburg was set up as a colony for epileptics. The first superintendent was Dr. Albert Priddy. Priddy claimed that Virginia was accumulating an ever-increasing population of the feeble-minded. His solution was to commit these people to the colony and to lobby for their sterilization. But there was no secure legal framework that would allow this operation. By the 1920s, however, Priddy had found the sort of model legislation he needed. It had been drafted a few years earlier by the prominent biologist, Dr. Harry Laughlin. Laughlin's model law called for the compulsory sterilization of those who were blind, deaf, deformed, alcoholic, drug-addicted, tubercular, syphilitic, or leprous. It also included criminals and the feeble-minded, as well as paupers and the homeless.
They were trying to make sure that we kept the white race as pure as possible, and that people who were dragged down the level of the white race would no longer be able to breed. They stopped short of killing them, but they made sure that they wouldn't have any children. And the project was supposed to have been, legally, was supposed to have been focused on mentally retarded people or mentally ill people who had a hereditary form of mental retardation or illness that would be passed on to their kids. In fact, it was people who were poor, teenagers. We're not talking about adults here. We're talking about teenagers, sometimes young teenagers, who were poor, who came from broken homes, who had been raped or had children out of wedlock, boys who had stolen things or run away from home, who were rounded up mostly by welfare workers, put in the institution, sometimes just put in solely for the purpose of being sterilized.
But how could such a policy of mass sterilization have been sanctioned in a free society? Dr. Paul Lombardo has spent 13 years studying the legal history of Virginia's program. He started at Amherst Courthouse, where the Lynchburg sterilizations were authorized and the record.
The theory of eugenics. Eugenics is a somewhat peculiar word to a modern ear, but at the time, people understood it to mean the science, if you can call it a science, of being well born. That is, the science of good breeding, of heredity, of having healthy, productive people marry other healthy, productive people and have children, and preventing those who were not healthy and productive from having any children at all.
The word eugenics was coined by the British scientist Sir Francis Galton in 1883. Galton was a cousin of Charles Darwin. The eugenicists wanted to encourage survival of the fittest while eliminating the unfit through surgical sterilization. Eugenicists claimed that simple laws of heredity could be applied to all kinds of complex human qualities.
Mental capacities as well as physical characters are inherited. The family history shows special talents reappearing in successive generations. Feeble-mindedness and many other undesirable qualities are also heritable.
Fearing that the nation was being swamped by defectives, the eugenicists believed that government should have the power to prevent further racial degeneration. Social reformers on the left, as well as the right, were seduced by the idea. Writers like H.G. Wells and George Bernard Shaw, and politicians like Winston Churchill, believed that eugenic sterilization would improve the vigor of the nation and save millions on welfare, prisons, and hospitals. In Britain, Galton's ideas were never put into practice. It was a different story in the United States.
In America, the ideas that were propounded by the eugenicists were taken up as a practical way of limiting reproduction among people whom some felt should not reproduce.
Compulsory sterilization had strong support from American politicians. It also had a broad appeal to ordinary people. Along with prizes for pig breeders and pie bakers, state fairs held fitter family contests to reward those who practiced good breeding. Eugenics became a household word, but there were a few dissenting voices. Hollywood was one.
Sit down. I want to talk to you. I'm Miss White of the Welfare Association. You're 17, aren't you, Alice? Yes. But what have you done with my folks? Well, we thought it necessary to present your family's case to the State Medical Commission. And after an examination, they decided it was the one important action to take. To have your entire family sterilized. Why, what's that? I don't know what you're talking about. Well, we investigated your family's history, Alice. And those of the past 3 generations have been feeble-minded, congenital cripples, or habitual drunkards. Instead of improving, each generation is more of a problem. Now, in this state, we have a law which provides for such people to have an operation so there won't be any more children. I see. You can go back to your job, please. I'll arrange to have a telephone point. But I'm quitting my job. I'm not going anywhere. Now, you're going to the hospital, too, Alice.
And you mean they're going to stop me from having children ever?
Exactly.
I'm all right, I tell you. I won't go to any hospital.
By the mid-1920s, the eugenicists were determined to overcome all opposition to enforced sterilization. During his research, Dr. Paul Lombardo uncovered an extraordinary conspiracy. Dr. Albert Priddy, a Lynchburg superintendent, had been privately sterilizing inmates, but stopped in 1917 when he was sued for damages by a victim. Fearful of being sued again, Priddy needed Dr. Laughlin's model law to be declared constitutional by the highest court in the land. In 1924, Priddy colluded with others to bring a test case before the U.S. Supreme Court, a case they knew they would win. It began here at Amherst and became known as Buck versus Bell.
Buck versus Bell was the first time that the United States Supreme Court said that it was okay under the Constitution to sexually sterilize someone because they were likely to have children who were, in the words of the court, socially inadequate.
The person Priddy used to serve his purposes was a teenage girl named Carrie Buck. Carrie came from a poor family that lived in Charlottesville, Virginia. Her mother, Emma, was suspected of being a prostitute and had already been committed to Lynchburg. They said she was feeble-minded. Carrie was sent to live with foster parents, John and Alice Dobbs. John Dobbs worked on the railway in Charlottesville and was active in local affairs. When Carrie was 16, she was raped by a nephew of the Dobbs in this house. She became pregnant, and in 1924 gave birth to a little girl, who she named Vivian. Ashamed of what had happened, the Dobbs wanted to be rid of Carrie and reported her to the authorities. Although a victim of rape, her pregnancy out of wedlock was sufficient to have her taken away to the Lynchburg colony. What happened to Carrie would change the lives of tens of thousands of poor teenagers like her. When Carrie Buck arrived at Lynchburg, she found herself in terrifying circumstances. Torn from her daughter Vivian, she was brought before Dr. Albert Priddy, whose stated mission was to rid the nation of people like her. Priddy examined Carrie and classified her, like her mother, as feeble-minded of the moron class, a moral delinquent and worthy of sexual sterilization. In fact, she was none of these things, but Priddy now had 2 generations of the Buck family locked away. Priddy knew that the Virginia law only applied to people with hereditary defects, so Carrie Buck appeared the perfect subject for Priddy's test case.
Probably the most important person after Dr. Priddy was a man named Aubrey Strode. Aubrey Strode was the attorney who represented the Virginia colony in this case. Mr. Strode served a term as a senator in the state assembly. He also acted as a lobbyist, and he wrote legislation at the request of people like Dr. Priddy. His counterpart was a lawyer named Irving Whitehead, who was appointed to represent Carrie Buck. Mr. Whitehead had more than a passing acquaintance with the Virginia colony as well. He had been a member of its first special board of directors. He had actually voted to sterilize people even before the specific statute was passed in 1924. Whitehead and Strode had been friends. They'd grown up together in the village of Amherst. They had been business associates, political friends, and had worked together in lobbying to gain additional funding for the Virginia colony.
They set up the Supreme Court challenge to this in what can only be described as a sweetheart deal, with everybody who participated in the lawsuit being someone who was strongly in favor of the sterilization law, including the person who was supposed to be representing Carrie Buck. So it was an outrage. That case was an outrage that it went forward and that they accepted those ideas.
As proceedings got underway at Amherst Courthouse, expert evidence was given against Carrie by a man who had never examined her, never even met her. It was Dr. Harry Laughlin, the very man who wrote the model sterilization law. Dr. Laughlin was in charge of the Eugenics Record Office on Long Island, New York. This organization tracked down so-called problem families and promoted the idea of compulsory sterilization. Dr. Laughlin was America's leading eugenicist. He trained hundreds of field workers to gather data on families he thought should be sterilized. When Priddy needed an expert witness to testify against Carrie, Laughlin was the obvious choice.
Even though Laughlin never met Carrie Buck, never examined her, in fact, never saw her, he produced a deposition for her trial. The deposition was based verbatim on information given to him by Dr. Pretty, and the deposition repeated the phrase that Pretty used to describe the Buck family. These people belong to the shiftless, ignorant, and worthless class of antisocial whites of the South. That phrase made its way into the Supreme Court records of the Buck versus Bell case. Laughlin said that Carrie was a socially inadequate person, that she was a moral delinquent because she had had a child and hadn't been married, and that in fact all of the pointers of heredity indicated that her family was the source of this hereditary deficiency, and that Carrie herself would pass on her defects to those she had as children. The court also heard evidence from a woman named Carolyn Wilhelm. Ms. Wilhelm was a Red Cross nurse, and she was very familiar with the Buck family. She also had the opportunity to observe Carrie's child, Vivian, when Vivian was not more than 6 months old. When asked in court how that child responded, Ms. Wilhelm was unable to come up with specifics, but said simply that there was something peculiar about the child. "I'm not sure exactly what it is," she said, "but there's something peculiar about it." It was that comment that became the basis for Carrie's sterilization. She was later condemned as one of 3 generations of imbeciles, her mother being the first, Carrie the second, and her daughter Vivian, who was simply somewhat peculiar, the third.
In the spring of 1927, the case of Buck versus Bell came before the U.S. Supreme Court. It was heard by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. Holmes is one of the greatest figures in American jurisprudence and is widely regarded as a libertarian. But in this case, he issued an opinion which was to deprive tens of thousands of Americans of their right to have children. Holmes said they could be forcibly sterilized by declaring, "The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes."
Holmes, in a phrase which is remembered even today, concluded that Carrie was, in fact, a feeble-minded mother of a feeble-minded daughter, herself the daughter of another feeble-minded mother. Drawing the line under these 3 people, Holmes said simply, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, and declared that the Virginia law was constitutional and could be applied to Carrie and others like her.
Do you know anything about her family background?
Yes, Your Honor, I do.
There are several other children, aren't there?
Yes.
What is their condition?
One is a cripple, 2 others might be classed as feeble-minded.
Isn't the oldest son in jail?
Well, yes, I believe so.
And knowing all that, you still contend that this girl should be allowed to bring more people like that into the world?
She's sound, Your Honor. She's not anything like the rest. Surely she should be given a chance to work out her own salvation.
I can't agree with you, Doctor. Suppose she is normal. The chances are that her children will inherit the family fate. Is that possible?
But, Your Honor,
I'm sorry, Doctor. 3 generations of unfit are enough. Petition not allowed.
Don't you understand what you're doing? Look at me. Can't you see that I'm well and strong? And I'll be a good mother too, Judge. Honest, I will.
After Buck versus Bell, the floodgates opened. American states began wholesale sterilization of poor citizens at the margins of society. Eugenics became a cornerstone of American social policy. States competed to sterilize the largest numbers of citizens and boasted of how much public money they saved. In 1933, Hitler came to power. One of his first acts was to introduce a eugenic sterilization law. While Hitler encouraged breeding from ideal human stock, his Sterilization Act marked the beginning of the Holocaust. In the first 3 years, the Nazis sterilized more than 225,000 people. The final total was nearly 500,000. Throughout the Nazi period, eugenic sterilizations in America increased. The Lynchburg authorities welcomed Hitler's sterilization law. Their annual report of 1933 praised the great German Republic. They wrote, "Apply the pruning knife with vigor." Hitler's sterilization law borrowed directly from Dr. Harry Laughlin's American legislation. In 1936, the Nazis recognized Laughlin's contribution to race hygiene by giving him an honorary doctorate from the University of Heidelberg. Virginia health officials envied the Nazi sterilization program. In 1934, one of them declared, "The Germans are beating us at our own game." In Hitler's Germany, sterilization soon gave way to the killing of mental patients by lethal injection, and ultimately, the final solution, in which more than 6 million died.
It was obvious that the program that America had some influence on the Nazis. I was startled to find that out. I always thought that the Nazis kind of thought it up for themselves. It struck me as incredibly ironic that before World War II, there was all this very florid language in the reports about eugenics. And and sterilizations ran high. After World War II, the sterilizations did not drop. They just changed the language.
Judy Crockett wanted Virginia's sterilization law repealed and for the state to pay compensation. But she needed to find victims of the program to build her case.
Among the first people that I interviewed was Doris Buck, who was Carrie Buck's sister, and her husband, Matthew Figgins. They had just recently found out that she had been sterilized. They had spent most of their lives trying to have kids, and finally realizing that they weren't going to, adopting their nephews and nieces. And they were still very upset about having found out that she had been sterilized. It was clear to me when I interviewed her that there was something drastically wrong with this program. I mean, bad as it would have been if it had only sterilized mentally retarded people, it was much worse to have sterilized and ruined the lives of people who were clearly not retarded and obviously able to function in society. Just reaching the victims of the program was an enormous obstacle for us. These were folks who were really deeply humiliated and hurt by the fact that they had been institutionalized in the first place, and then that the state had decided that they were so disgusting that they shouldn't be allowed to have kids. We didn't feel that it was our business to ferret people out. They needed to want to come to us. The reporters were ferreting people out. So when they ferreted them out, they would say, "You should call the ACLU."
One of the reporters who searched for the victims is Mary Bishop of the Roanoke Times. 13 years later, she's still concerned with their plight.
I was looking through court records from the 20s and 30s, looking for people who had been sterilized at the colony, looking for people who'd lived through all that. And among those names, I found a Jesse Frank Meadows. And I looked in the Lynchburg phone book and found a Jesse F. Meadows and called him. And I said, "Well, I'd like to come and talk with you." And he said, "Well, come right over." So I went over that day, and it was about all I could take just to hear an hour of it at that time because there was such sadness in it. Mr. Meadows' mother died in childbirth when he was 13, and his father quickly married another woman, and his stepmother decided she didn't want to raise any of the children. She wanted all the children to be dispersed. He was sent to the Virginia colony.
He was just 17 years old. He was sent there in 1940.
Hey, Mr. Meadows. How you doing? Good to see you. Nice day, huh? Hey, puppy. Sure is. Got a nice breeze here, though, as always.
Took me up in the operating room and maybe take them shots. And took me up to the doctors come in and nurses and examined me and see if I was numb enough for me to do it. And they started cutting it.
Were you watching?
Yeah. After I went back to the War in 10, I was sore for a week or two. Now they walked me. Some people really bad when they operate on them. They put them back in the hospital. And give them more shots and give them penicillin, nearly killed some of them.
Mr. Meadows would love to have been a father, and he would have been a very good father. He loves children, and he really misses that. He's very sad that could not have happened to him.
It's been terrible. I wanted some children when I got older. Pretty hard life. And one boy took him out when he was 15. They threatened to have him done like that. His mother and father got lawyers and got him away from it before they had time to do it. Some other boys, when they'd run away and go in the service to keep them from doing it.
Sterilization was not the only scandal at the Lynchburg colony. Able-bodied inmates were exploited for their labor. Boys worked on the colony's farm for as little as 25 cents a week. The girls served in the dining hall and were made to help on the wards. Other inmates had their labor sold outside the colony and worked as virtual slaves.
I felt like I'd never get out. The way they talked, I'd never get out. So they needed me there for the work. So they didn't have enough painters to have to keep me there till they got somebody. So if I painted till they got somebody, then they would give me a raise. All I ever seen was 25 cents a week.
Punishments at Lynchburg were severe. One of the most frequent was the blind room, tiny cells where inmates were placed in solitary confinement for up to 90 days. Their heads were shaved, and they were made to wear a hospital gown. The cells contained nothing except a mattress and a bucket.
I didn't like it then, and I run. And when I come back, they put me in this blind room. Put me in there, and I stayed in there for a while. And they'd get somebody was mean, another patient was mean, and put them in the blind room with me. Make them stay in there with me, and I was scared to death. And I saw something there one day. I'm not calling no name. And I saw this person, I'm gonna say person, I think it sounds better. Beat this patient, didn't have too much mind. put her in a straitjacket and all, and twist her arms behind. And they used to carry these real heavy keys, you know, on the side of the pocket, and took and was beating this patient with it. And next morning when I got up, the patient was dead. And I asked a certain party, I said, what happened to her? She said, well, she deceased. But I think she really, you know, beat her death with the keys. And I was scared to say anything about it. Because they said if I said anything about it, I'd get the same thing that patient did. And that was the worst part, I guess.
Despite repeated stories like Mary Donnell's, the state denied all liability. But Judy Crockett pressed ahead with a lawsuit on behalf of the victims.
Once we got the victims, then the state really started to go berserk. We wanted to get their medical records, and the state threw up all kinds of roadblocks. The governor at that time, Governor Dalton, announced to the press, no, I'm not going to notify people so that they can sue the state for the ACLU. So we really had to fight through the state's resistance to letting us get at their documents.
Eventually, Judy Crockett's persistence paid off.
We discovered as we started to finally get the records that there had been a kind of a kangaroo court proceeding where the teenage inmate was brought before someone who was acting as a judge and accompanied by someone who was supposed to be acting as their attorney representing their best interest, and that there was some sort of form of a hearing where the issue was discussed. I was startled to find out that there was any kind of a hearing because most of the people I talked to didn't recall ever having a moment at which they were told that they were going to be sterilized and asked if they agreed to be sterilized. And what we found when we started looking at the hearings was that they were completely lacking in all the necessary elements that you have to have when somebody is agreeing to a medical procedure or any sort of a procedure. That the person who was supposed to be representing their best interest in most cases had never met them, never discussed the issue with them. In fact, often didn't even seem to know their name, never even spoke.
Hearing officer, how old are you? Boy, 17. How long have you been here? About 8 months. Are you going to school? I was going, but I quit. Do you like the movies? Yes, sir. Do you like the funnies? Yes, sir. You don't mind being operated on, do you? No, sir. All right, you can go ahead. Hearing officer, how old are you? Girl, 16. Where is your home? Richmond. How long have you been here? 5 months. You like it here all right? Yes. You know what sterilization is? Yes. All right with you? Yes.
They asked me, do you know what this meeting is for? I said, no, sir, I don't. They said, well, this is a meeting that you go through when you have to have a serious operation, and it's for your health. That's the way they explained it to me. And I said, well, if it's for my health, then I guess I'll go on through it. See, I didn't know no difference.
The children there knew that they would not be able to be released unless they were sterilized. In some of the records, in papers other than the hearings, it was specified. She can't be released yet to her family because she hasn't been sterilized. We're waiting until she's sterilized before she can be released.
Well, after they completed their hospitalization stay, they would just re-enter into the various education and training programs as if nothing happened. Forgive the remark, but I don't think sterilization cut the gleam out of anybody's eye. It was just, I think, a procedure to not permit people to have subnormal, quotation marks, children, that couldn't function too well in society.
It was obvious that they had suffered a really deep blow to their sense of who they were, and one that was never going to be able to be fixed. What accompanied that was the clear sense that the state had thought that they were basically trash, worthless. And having children was a very big focus in their lives. It was something they had expected to do. It was something that they wanted to do. It would have made an enormous difference. Numbers of them felt that their marriages had been ruined, their husbands had left or whatever, because they couldn't have children. And I believe that's probably true.
I guess I stayed there about 16 years. In 1958, I stayed over 1958. And then when I married, he come got me out and married me. I reckon that was the best part of my life. And him and I got married. And I told him all that my life, you know. I told him that I hadn't been sterilized, I couldn't have no child. But at the time, he said, it didn't make no difference, you know, if I can have a child or not. He loved me like I was. So we was married about, let's say 10 years. I had 10 years of good marriage. And then he decided he wanted to get divorced. And I figured me being sterilized and all that was, you know, was cause our marriage being broke up like that. Because he loved children, you know, and all that. He loved kids. And I used to lay in my bed and cry because I couldn't give him what he wanted. I wanted to give him a son to bear his name, because most men, they want, you know, want a son to bear their name. And I cried. He said, well, don't worry about it, honey. Everything's gonna be all right. But then as years go by, I don't know, he began to change his mind. So he got divorced and married somebody else. That's the end of that story now.
The Virginia sterilization program ended only in 1972. Despite the best efforts of Judy Crockett and her colleagues, the 8,300 victims were never to receive justice. The court ordered a final settlement in 1985.
I have to admit that I was disappointed. It was clear from early on that the judge was not going to declare something unconstitutional that the Supreme Court had said earlier was okay. What I most deeply would have wanted would be a sincere apology from the governor on behalf of the state of Virginia. Most of the people that we dealt with had either had the sterilizations or found out about the sterilizations long enough ago that we could not have asked for any money for them. What we did get was an announcement on the radio and in the papers to people that if they had been in institutions in these times and had an operation, they should get in touch with the state. And the state did agree to provide some sort of mental health counseling, but they would never agree to paying for reversal operations.
Harry Buck, sterilized because of a Supreme Court decision in 1927, left Lynchburg, got married, and worked as a housekeeper. After the death of her first husband, she married Charles Dettamore. They returned to Charlottesville and were found living in abject poverty in a house with no heat or running water. Carrie was eventually taken to a nursing home, where in 1982, Paul Lombardo met her. She had just played the role of the Virgin Mary in a Christmas pageant. Carrie died a few weeks later in January 1983. A handful of people attended her funeral, which took place on a cold, rainy day. Dr. Lombardo was the only mourner who knew the drama which had begun with Carrie's rape in 1923 and continued with her forced sterilization in 1927. Dr. Lombardo discovered 2 other gravestones in the Charlottesville cemetery which relate to Carrie's story. One belongs to the Dobbs family, her foster parents, whose nephew had raped her and caused the birth of her daughter, Vivian. After Carrie had been taken away to Lynchburg, Vivian was adopted by the Dobbs. Next to the Dobbs monument is a tiny gravestone with the legend V.A.E.D., Vivian Alice Elaine Dobbs, Carrie's daughter, who died tragically at the age of 8 from an intestinal disorder. Paul Lombardo learned that Vivian attended the Venable School in Charlottesville. He went there to look for evidence of her alleged feeble-mindedness.
I came here to the Venable School, ultimately, and found the report cards of Vivian, which demonstrated to me what I had suspected all along. There were no generations of imbeciles in the Buck family. Not 3, not 2, not even 1. Least of all, Vivian, who at one point had even been on the honor roll in this very school.
Carrie Buck's story has a strange footnote. Dr. Harry Laughlin, the man who testified against her, himself became the kind of person he wanted to sterilize. He developed severe epilepsy and was dismissed by his employers, the Eugenics Record Office. The work of the Eugenics Record Office was discredited as early as 1935 by a team of independent scientists. They judged its methods and records unsatisfactory for the study of human genetics. The eugenicists wanted a neat and orderly society, with social problems excised by the surgeon's knife. In the case of Buck versus Bell, they presented false evidence to justify compulsory sterilization. Throughout America, they forced 70,000 people to undergo unnecessary operations and robbed them of the ability to have children.
We don't have the wisdom to make those decisions. We don't begin to understand what makes a good person or what makes a worthwhile person. We're so caught up in our prejudices and our habits, and we could lose this beautiful variety, this wonderful messiness that we have in the world, and we could get so terribly tidy. We could tidy away all of our flaws and lose all of our wonder, all of our excitement, all of our unexpectedness.
Catch the best from independent filmmakers tomorrow night, starting at 10:30 when Independent View shows the latest film and video. It's followed at 11 by 2 features about crooks without a clue. Zoom in on independent films tomorrow night at 10:30 on KQED, on the web at kqed.org.